Please welcome a partner from cyber and data protection sector at Ronan Daly German, Ricky Kelly, and the global head of technical direction with BSI Cybersecurity and Information Resilience, Mr. Nick Hayes. Gentlemen, you're very welcome. Right, I leave it to you guys to tell us how to clear up that mess. Thank you.
So when we were asked to come speak to here today, I thought what better way of doing that than by actually responding to a real-life hack. And if I see some scared faces here, even though I can't really see that many now, thankfully, I hope you haven't been too traumatized by how easy and quickly it is for those types of incidents to take place. In reality, as you've seen, it took my colleagues Ed and Christopher just 15 minutes to hack into someone's and get access to someone's account. It takes an awful lot longer than that to respond to an incident. On average, it takes about 60 days to recover from an incident, and that takes into consideration, obviously, smaller size incidents and larger size incidents. So it can take often much longer than that to recover from an incident. There are various factors that you need to take into consideration, and this is me getting my legal disclaimer out of the way. Factors like, for example, the nature of the type of breach. If it's a ransomware attack, you might take a different approach, for example, to if it is, a simple business email compromise. There are other factors you need to take into consideration. Maybe, for example, the nature of the organization. If the organization is processing large amounts of special category personal data, then it'll have additional considerations to maybe an organization simply shredding paper, or an organization that is providing essential services like healthcare or transport or telecommunications. For those that have simply, put something in place, it's no longer sufficient. Organizations have additional obligations, and those obligations are set out in various ways depending on the type of organization that's there. That's me with my legal disclaimer out of the way, and I'd like now to turn the table on you a little bit and maybe ask you some questions, some simple questions, and it's all in secret here, so you're okay, don't worry. My first question is, should be coming up on screen there now. So if I ask you to go back to your Slido app, and at the top you'll see a tab which says poll, and in there you'll see the very first question. Again, I see some frightened faces, and many of you here, as soon as you start to disconnect yourself from the Wi-Fi that is here for free today, then we might start to see some responses. So we're starting to see some responses there now, and while that is working away, I'm just going to give you some statistics that we've seen recently in the news. Microsoft have reported that they're experiencing 6.5 billion online threats on a daily basis. It's a very significant number, enormous really. Maybe closer to home, in Ireland alone, the theft of 4.4 million euros arising from invoice redirection fraud was reported to the policing authorities in Ireland this year. That's expected to be a significant underreporting of the reality of what has been experienced in the area of invoice redirection fraud. But nonetheless, it's significant. What's probably more significant is 75% of the money that has been stolen has not been recovered. 75% of the money has gone to the criminals and has not been recovered. So we're starting to see some of the responses here. We've got 52 responses, and you'll see here, obviously very significantly, 55% of people here are aware that they've suffered a cybersecurity breach. For those 54%, I'm sure you now have fairly detailed processes in place to deal with cyber incidents. For those that have not, you might want to reconsider that in light of what you've seen here today, and obviously prepare. It's interesting to see that there are a small percentage of people who'd rather not say. What I say to you is, it's okay, you've come to the right place, and there's help in hand. Our next question is, are you confident in your ability to detect and adequately respond to a cybersecurity breach? So as you're reacting to that there, you see, again, you're getting to see some results, but IBM, and I hope Coase doesn't mind me quoting him, IBM have estimated that in their 2018 cybercrime survey that the average time to detection is 197 days. That's 197 days that a hacker is sitting on your system, gathering information about you and about what you do on a daily basis. And again, we're seeing some results here, and people quite clearly now saying no they've come to the right place again. There is processes in place, technology in place that help you detect detect breaches as they arise, and it would be good to investigate those.
Thank you, Ricky. There's a third question, if we can hopefully flick onto that one. And really what I want to find out here is amongst the people who have got confidence that they could detect and respond to an incident, how many people have carried out an attack simulation or maybe dry run some of their plans and policies and things like that to really get a feel for whether they're appropriate or whether they stand up in the face of being used in anger. And I kind of, this is kind of what I expected, more so to the no, and certainly across the other questions as well. I kind of expected that might be the case, what the answers we got. And really what we're saying here with this point is that, ultimately, it's all well and good having a policy or a plan, but that could actually fall down when you actually first come to use it and may not be appropriate at all. It may actually constrict your ability to respond to an incident appropriately.
So why is good incident response important? Well, firstly, there's a legal obligation now. One of those obligations, legal obligations, arises as a result of the introduction of GDPR and the data protection legislation that we're seeing now and the evolution of that legislation. But one of those obligations is obviously you have to report breaches of personal data to the Data Protection Commission without undue delay and in any event within 72 hours. So again, if you're suffering a personal data breach, you have an obligation to report that. That reporting obligation is once you become aware of the incident. It's not sufficient to simply say we never became aware, because now you have an obligation to implement technical and organizational measures sufficient to justify or to address your risks. Those technical and organizational measures require you to put in place processes to allow you to detect breaches as they arise and as soon as they arise. There's a mechanism for determining what you should do in terms of technical and organizational measures, and I don't have time to go into that today, but it's basically the state of the art, which wasn't defined under GDPR, but there has been some helpful guidance issued at European level, which basically means that once something passes from scientific knowledge or research into being available on the market, it is at that stage it enters into the state of the art, and is at that level that GDPR requires. Additional obligations, of course, come contractually, for example, if you have entered into data processing agreements, or depending on who you might be regulated by, you might have additional obligations in terms of your obligations around incident response. Damage to reputation can't be left aside. Damage to reputation arising from security breaches is very significant. But if you have good incident response, you can take mitigation, and you can take mitigation steps to reduce the risk arising from a breach below that of high risk, and you may avoid having to notify your data subjects, for example. If you don't have to notify your data subjects, you may have a better chance of reducing the damage to your reputation and therefore the losses to your organization. Again, I mentioned contractual obligations, but there's also now arising from GDPR the claims from data subjects. Data subjects can claim for material and non-material loss. Non-material loss is significant. The main case in Ireland, while it predates GDPR and ultimately got turned over because non-material loss claims weren't allowed under the old regime, there was an award of €15,000 to the plaintiff in that instance where they suffered no material loss. Again, we're waiting for the law to develop there, but in the UK they've given some helpful guidance, and all you need to show in the UK is that you've suffered distress and loss, and your data has been used inappropriately. So that's why, from an organization perspective, you should have good incident response.
And that's right. Thanks, Ricky. And might just go back to that point you made there about you know, the impact, the reputational damage, perhaps. And you know, it'd probably be fair to say that quite a few high-profile attacks would end up in the news these days. You know, do you want to be headline news, let's say on the BBC News or the Irish Times or whatever that might be? No, is probably the answer. And what you also don't want is you don't want an attacker in your network or controlling your assets for 196 days either, undetected. Obviously that's not where you want to be, and we want to, as an industry, we really need to bring that number right down to a low level. And if we look at also the, let's say the TTP, so the tactics, techniques and procedures that the attacking groups use, and the modus operandi, you know, people out there, the attackers are not doing anything majorly special. Most of the time it's kind of basic attacks, you know, it can be considered an APT or whatever you want to call it. But ultimately, they're using the same techniques that we as an industry would use to do the penetration testing or the attack simulation assessments of your organizations. So, you know, it's really, we're not talking about hugely sophisticated attacks. You kind of just need to know your threat profile. You know, if we're facing a nation-state attacker, yeah, fair enough, that's probably going to be reasonably advanced, but, you know, a hacktivist or a sophisticated attacker are using techniques that we're aware of as an industry, let's say. And that from a technical point of view, that's quite important. It's things we can defend against. We're not defending the undefensible, let's say.
So just looking at you know, incident response, we at Rowan Daly German, we observe and really implement the CREST framework for incident response. There are others available, but we use the CREST one, and that involves 3 main phases. So phase 1 is preparation, phase 2 respond, and 3 is follow up. We're going to touch on each of those now, but it is my strong view, and I'm sure that's shared by Nick, that preparation is by, you know, really the most important element of any incident response. Preparation, what does it involve? So really, you know, what you need to be starting with is you need to consider the risks to the organization. You do that by looking at the organization, looking at the nature of the organization. What is the location of the organization? Is it processing data inside the European Union, outside the European Union? Does it engage processors from outside the European Union? What agreements are in place with those processors? If it's collecting information, it needs to have, and it's sharing that, it needs to make sure it has agreements in place in line with its legal obligations. You need to consider the key assets of the organization. So what those assets might be, for example, it might be its information. It might be financial information. It might be intellectual property. It might be commercially sensitive information, trade secrets. Again, what you need to do as an organization, you need to carry out an assessment of what an incident against those assets would cause to the organization. What would be the effect in the organization of a breach happening to those key assets? On top of that, the organization needs to look at its policies and procedures. Has it got, for example, in its employee manual, a bring your own device policy? Does it have processes in place around payment of invoices, changing of financial information? What processes are in place? And it should examine those having regard to the risks to the organization. They're just some of the key items that need to be considered when you're preparing for incident response. And I think Nick may have some more.
Yeah, I do. I totally agree as well. The preparation phase, at least from a technical point of view, is, if it's done right and done well, it is going to set you up for being able to respond adequately to when an incident does occur. You know, you might ask the same, you know, ask questions of, I might come at assets from a different angle. Actually, I might talk about assets in terms of workstations or servers, or, you know, websites or mobile apps, that kind of thing. So, and what you want to do in the preparation phase is make sure that as an organisation you've got good visibility of what you have out there on the perimeter. And I think the panel before the simulator or the demo talked about visibility. So knowing what you have out there, what's connected to the internet, what is your attack surface essentially. And as we've moved more towards, you know, hybrid setups or cloud setups, The borderlines of what would be a perimeter these days for an organisation have changed quite drastically. You know, we're now having to defend against all these different attacks from different areas, and having the visibility of all that is key. Second of all, you might look at asking the right questions around login. So do we have the ability to log what happens on these assets? You know, do we log that centrally? Is that forensically sound? Do we maintain the chain of custody and things like that if something does go wrong? And we might also ask a question of, you know, as an organisation, do you know what normal looks like? So, for example, on a Tuesday morning, do you know what that, you know, normalised level of traffic for a website might be? If you're going to get thousands of login attempts at 3 a.m. in the morning from a Chinese IP address, that's probably not normal. But if you're getting them a smaller number from some Irish IP addresses at the middle of the day, lunchtime, for example, that might be considered normal. So it's about having that visibility and knowing what's normal for you as an organisation. And really that will set you forward and on the right path.
So now, for the purpose of the response piece, we're going to presume that the organisation that we're going to be talking about has prepared, at least to some extent, and it now has a feeling it might have suffered a cyber breach arising from, as you've seen that here today, the taking of someone's password. And when they capture someone's password, it'll allow them to access maybe other clients, for example, accessing their email client account, and which, if successful, results in a business email compromise, which is currently the attack of choice of most hackers. And while it is relatively unsophisticated, it can be very costly to recover from, given the amount of data that organizations are processing in their email accounts. So what will we do first? An organization has a feeling it may have suffered a breach. The first question is really that you need to ask is, what are your symptoms? What symptoms are you experiencing? Have you loss of operations? Have you just dumped 1 million emails and spam emails to your clients, to your customers, to your employees? Once you have an idea of your symptoms, you then need to look at the nature of the breach and see you know, what has been going on and how you became aware. So how you became aware, maybe you were contacted by a third party. Maybe one of your clients has said, I've received an email from you asking you to change your financial information. Did you send this? Obviously, if you did not, you're going to be a little bit freaked out possibly, but making contact with that person fairly quickly, and you're going to be investigating, or should be looking to investigate fairly quickly. So once you've done that, you really should be engaging your first responders. Your first responders should be able to identify whether a breach has happened. Sorry, not identify whether a breach has happened, but should be able to identify whether and be sufficiently resourced as to whether external services are required, and also whether it should be escalated to full incident response. At that stage, we know now, we're presuming that someone has suffered a business email compromise or you know, a Wi-Fi hack, and their account has been compromised. We've now immediately refer out, escalate up to full incident response. The team should include C-level management, including HR, PR, legal, and technical, obviously. And you'd be asking technically immediately to start your investigation. I'll let Nick talk about that in a second, but very quickly you should be also then considering, and this is a key, they should be looking at along the whole stage of the process, have you sufficient information to determine that you've suffered a data breach, and what are your additional obligations? If you have suffered a data breach, or you feel you may have suffered a data breach, you should be looking to make a report to Data Protection Commission, obviously because you could be regarded as being aware, and you have an obligation to report as soon as you become aware.
Thank you. Yeah, and as Ricky said there, there's a key question in all that part of the first phase is the classification of the incident. So are we talking about simply an event, or has that been elevated up to the level of a full incident? Does that now require a more robust response? In the example here of the Wi-Fi attack, certainly there'll be some technology out there in terms of access points that can detect a de-authentication attack. You know, you might have rogue access point detection and things like that. And I guess what I'll do is I'll take it back to the same question I had at the preparation stage is, do you know what normal looks like? And for your organisation in a particular premise, do you know what Wi-Fi network should be visible from this particular location, or, you know, the third floor upstairs and things like that? And if you know that and you have that visibility, anything that comes up there and is out of an anomaly, let's say, you're going to be in a better position to be able to detect and respond to that. But as you said, we've kind of assumed that there's been an incident here. We've kind of classified it that way. What we're looking to do is actually isolate it. So the key word is isolate, and what we're trying to do is tie that attacker down and basically put restrictions in place. There'll be certain key decisions to be made throughout this process, and they'll differ for different organisations. They'll have a different risk appetite. Some organisations might be more comfortable with letting an attacker proceed a little bit further. So it's the watch and see modus operandi to a certain extent. Can we establish what the motives might be, or a less risk-averse organisation might simply look to cut that off at an early stage. And really what they're trying to do is isolate. So there's things you can do there from a technical point of view. You might look to, if it's a particular user account, in the case of a email breach, you might look to disable that account, for example, straight away. You might look to review the logs or the access logs, where was it logged into and from where. You might also look to enable you should be having multi-factor authentication anyway, but if it's not, let's stick it on there. And also change the password, and then we can start looking at getting back to normal operations at that point.
So at that stage, we'd be looking, from a legal advisor's perspective, we'd be looking to get a report from the technical advisors directly to us to describe to us the nature of the incident, the type of the incident, and the effect of the incident. What has been the impact on the organisation? Obviously, we'd be asking them to report back to us directly because it maintains privilege, and that'll be very important for the next phase that I'll talk about in a second. But once you have that legal report, then you're advising your client or you're advising your employer, as the case may be, of the implications for the breach on them. And also then you're considering their legal obligations. They may have contractual obligations. For example, if they're a processor, that contractual obligation might be to notify the controller of that data within 24 hours of them becoming aware of the breach. They may be a regulated entity. They may be the provider of essential services like healthcare, transport, telecommunications, for example, all of whom have additional obligations. So again, you're looking at the implications on the obligations of the organisation, with that, as quickly as possible, you'll be considering what your next steps should be. You may well then, at that stage, if you haven't already, be preparing notifications to the Commission, for example, or any other people that you may need to notify. And if you are satisfied that there's been data subjects and you've been in a position to identify the data subjects, then you should start the process of notifying those data subjects. In a spam email scenario, for example, if there's been a dump, then you may wish to have your PR crisis management there very quickly so that they can respond to that and send emails to all of those who have received your email, just to tell them, we have suffered a breach, we're investigating it, but we ask you to not change our financial information. You can change the message will depend on the incident. And again, you're considering your obligations at that stage and the steps that need to be taken as necessary.
Again, yeah, and on top of that, there's also a technical piece around the next steps as well. And once we're quite comfortable that we've isolated the attacker, we've maybe disabled their immediate influence, we might start looking a little wider than that. So let's expand the incident response, and let's have a look at adjoining machines. So adjacent machines, maybe a web server in the DMZ got compromised. So let's have a look at other hosts in the DMZ, and let's have a look at where that particular compromised machine connects to, and so on and so forth. And let's really expand it out a little bit. And just to get that peace of mind, that we've covered things off to a good extent. And at that point, we now start looking at bolstering the security measures that we have in place. And I'm a good believer of basic security measures. What I said earlier on, we're not really, most of us are not defending against a nation state. And so we can sort of say, these are defensible things, and I'm a good believer of doing the right basics well, and in multiple layers. So if we do have a breach, and let's assume that we probably will at some point, I think the numbers there said that we're not quite sure, but let's assume that we do, and people should adopt that stance. I think it's worthwhile to say, I've lost my train of thought there because the thing's flashing at me at 10 seconds.
Okay. So just before we finish, really the end of the process really is continuing dialogue with the Data Protection Commission, for example, Once you finish the dialogue with the Commission, that'll probably take some time, depending on the nature of the breach. You will also be engaged, if necessary, you'll have carried out a significant review of the data that has been compromised with a view of notifying the data subjects if you haven't done so already. And once you've notified the data subjects, you're going to have issues around data subject access requests and obviously claims. And that's why it's very important to keep your early reports and maintain privilege over those, because if it results in litigation or actions by the DPC, for example, then that report will have the benefit of privilege, albeit the Commission, in my experience, always asks for a report, but you can always give them, if you wish, elements of it, or all of it, as the case may be, if you're happy enough with the nature of your response. You should then carry out a review of your policies and procedures, see how you reacted, and also carry out a review of the response to see how did you respond, was it sufficient, and what learnings can you take away from that, and what should you be implementing arising from that. As I said, you'll be continuing a dialogue with the DPC, and you'll be addressing claims, maybe contractual claims or data subject claims at that stage. Yeah,
and I think just closing points, it's probably worth, well, what we wanted to get across was that an incident response is not just technical and it's not just legal or PR angle, it's all of everything combined into one. And hopefully, you know, we kind of talked about doing the basics. So do the basics well, make sure you're well prepared, and that will stand you in good stead for when it does happen, because let's assume it does.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's it from us, and hopefully you found that helpful, and best of luck, I suppose.